At our anniversary dinner, my husband's best friend raised his glass and said, "Here's to another year with the temporary one." When my husband and I got married, everyone warned me about one person. Not his ex. Not his mother. His best friend. His name was Derek, and he'd been in my husband's life since they were 12 years old. They grew up on the same street, played on the same football team, attended the same college, and eventually worked in the same city. People described them as brothers. At first, I thought that sounded sweet. Then I met Derek. The first thing he ever said to me wasn't "nice to meet you." It was, "So, how long do you think you'll last?" Everyone laughed, including my husband. I forced a smile because I assumed it was just awkward humor. I wish that had been the end of it. Every family barbecue came with another joke. Derek called me wife number one, even though I'd never been married before. He joked that my husband always got bored with hobbies after a few years, so marriage probably wouldn't be any different. Whenever we hosted dinner, he'd ask where my husband's next upgrade was hiding. Every comment came wrapped in laughter. Every insult was disguised as comedy. Whenever I mentioned it to my husband, he'd tell me Derek didn't mean anything by it. That's just his sense of humor. I heard those words so often they started to lose all meaning. Eventually, I stopped bringing it up. I figured ignoring Derek was easier than arguing about him. 3 years passed. My husband and I bought our first home. We survived layoffs, a flooded basement, and months of renovating our kitchen together. If anything, our marriage grew stronger. Then our 4th wedding anniversary arrived. We planned a quiet dinner at a nice restaurant with a few close friends. Nothing extravagant. Just 8 people around one table. Derek was invited because, despite everything, he was still my husband's closest friend. The evening actually started well. Everyone laughed. We shared stories from college. The food was amazing. For almost 2 hours, I forgot how uncomfortable Derek usually made me feel. Then dessert arrived. Someone suggested a toast. Derek stood up holding his wine glass. He smiled directly at me. Then he said, "Here's to another year with the temporary one." The entire table froze. No one laughed. For a few seconds, all I could hear was the soft music playing through the restaurant. I looked at my husband. I expected him to immediately shut it down, to tell Derek enough was enough. Instead, he chuckled. Not loudly, not because he agreed, but he laughed. That tiny laugh hurt more than Derek's words ever could. Because in that moment, my husband told everyone at the table that insulting his wife wasn't worth correcting. I quietly placed my napkin beside my plate, picked up my purse, and walked out of the restaurant. No dramatic speech, no yelling, no tears, just silence. I heard my husband calling my name as I reached the parking lot. For the first time in 4 years. I didn't turn around. I drove home alone. The entire way, my phone kept lighting up. First my husband, then Derek, then friends who had been at the dinner. I ignored every call. When I got home, I changed into sweatpants, washed my makeup off, and sat quietly on the living room couch. I wasn't crying. Oddly enough, I felt calm. Not because I wasn't hurt, because something inside me had finally become impossible to ignore. It wasn't Derek who had broken my heart that night. It was my husband's silence. About 30 minutes later, I heard his car pull into the driveway. He rushed inside looking frustrated. The first words out of his mouth weren't an apology. They were just joking. I stared at him. Then I asked one question. "Can you repeat exactly what he said?" He hesitated. Finally, he quietly admitted it. "Here's to another year with the temporary one," I nodded. "And what part of that was funny?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For nearly a minute, neither of us spoke. Finally, he admitted he hadn't really laughed because he found it funny. He laughed because he felt uncomfortable. He didn't want to make the dinner awkward. I couldn't help smiling. Not because his answer made me feel better, because it explained everything. For 4 years, he had chosen avoiding awkwardness over protecting his wife. Every single time. I walked into the bedroom, packed a small suitcase, and told him I was staying with my sister for a while. He looked genuinely shocked. He kept saying I was overreacting, that it was one stupid joke. I calmly corrected him. It wasn't one joke. It was 4 years of jokes, and every single time, you let them happen, that finally made him quiet. The next morning, I received a text from Derek. It wasn't an apology. It said, "Wow, didn't know you were this sensitive." I read it once. Then blocked his number. Over the next week, my husband called constantly. He left flowers at my sister's house. He sent long messages explaining that he never meant to hurt me. One message stood out. "I honestly didn't realize it was this bad." That sentence hurt almost as much as the toast. Because how could he not realize? I told him, again, and again, and again. He simply hadn't believed it mattered. A few days later, one of the friends from the anniversary dinner called me. She apologized for not saying anything that night. Then she told me something I didn't know. After I left the restaurant, everyone had turned on Derek. One friend asked how he would feel if someone called his wife temporary. Another asked why he seemed obsessed with undermining my marriage. Derek laughed it off at first. Then someone pointed out that he had been making the exact same jokes since the day we met. The atmosphere apparently became so uncomfortable that several people left before finishing dessert. Even my husband had argued with Derek in the parking lot afterward. That surprised me. Not because he finally defended me, because it happened only after I was gone. A week later, my husband asked if we could meet for coffee. I agreed. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't been sleeping. He didn't waste time making excuses. Instead, he asked me one question. When did you stop feeling safe with me? The answer came immediately. The moment I realized I had to defend myself while you defended your friendship. His eyes filled with tears. He admitted something I'd suspected for years. Derek had always been the louder personality. The dominant one. Throughout their friendship, my husband had learned it was easier to laugh than challenge him. He had spent 20 years avoiding conflict with the same person. Unfortunately, that habit had come at my expense. Then he told me something I wasn't expecting. The morning after our anniversary dinner, he'd met Derek for breakfast. Not to smooth things over. To end the friendship. Apparently Derek still insisted I was too emotional. He even claimed my husband would eventually thank him because wives come and go, but lifelong friends stay. My husband stood up, left money on the table, and walked out. After 30 years of friendship, he blocked Derek's number. He looked at me across the coffee shop and quietly said, "I should have chosen my marriage the day I said I do. I just didn't realize I was choosing something else until you walked away." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But trust isn't rebuilt by ending one friendship. It's rebuilt by proving your priorities have actually changed, and I wasn't sure whether they had. I didn't move back home. Not right away. Instead, I suggested something my husband hadn't expected. Marriage counseling. If we were going to save our relationship, I didn't want promises. I wanted change. To his credit, he agreed immediately. Our first session was uncomfortable. The counselor asked us to describe the anniversary dinner from our own perspectives. I talked about humiliation. About spending 4 years waiting for my husband to speak up. About slowly realizing that every joke Derek made became a little more acceptable because no one ever challenged him. Then it was my husband's turn. He surprised me. He admitted that the problem hadn't started with Derek. It had started long before we met. Growing up, his father believed confrontation was disrespectful. Whenever someone insulted him, he laughed it off. Whenever relatives crossed boundaries, he stayed quiet to keep the peace. My husband had spent his entire life believing silence was maturity. The counselor gently corrected him. Silence isn't always peace. Sometimes silence is permission. That sentence stayed with both of us. Over the following months, we attended therapy every week. Something slowly changed. Not through grand romantic gestures. Through ordinary moments. The first test came at his office. One afternoon, a coworker made a sarcastic comment about another employee's appearance. Normally, my husband would have laughed awkwardly and changed the subject. Instead, he calmly said, "I don't think that's funny." The room fell silent. The conversation ended immediately. When he came home that night, he wasn't proud because he'd embarrassed someone. He was proud because, for the first time, he'd chosen honesty over comfort. Another test came during a family barbecue. One of his cousins joked that wives always become the boss after marriage. Before anyone else could laugh, my husband replied, "My wife isn't the boss. She's my partner." It was such a small comment. Most people probably forgot it within minutes. I didn't. Because it was the first time I'd ever watched him protect our relationship without me asking. Meanwhile, Derek wasn't finished. Apparently, being cut off didn't sit well with him. He started contacting mutual friends. According to them, I had manipulated my husband. I was controlling. I was trying to isolate him. Most people ignored the gossip. One person didn't. Derek's own wife. Her name was Melissa. One evening, she called me out of the blue. She apologized for disturbing me. Then she quietly admitted she'd been thinking about our anniversary dinner for months. She confessed something that completely changed how I viewed the entire situation. I wasn't the only woman Derek had treated that way. Throughout their marriage, he'd mocked Melissa in front of friends too. He called her the first draft. He joked that he could always trade up. Everyone assumed it was harmless because she laughed along. She admitted she laughed because she didn't know what else to do. Listening to her felt like hearing my own story from another angle. Except she had been living it for almost 10 years. A month later, Melissa filed for divorce. Not because of one joke. Because she finally realized the jokes reflected exactly how little respect Derek had for her. When my husband heard the news, he became very quiet. That evening he admitted something painful. If I hadn't changed, that could have been us. He was right. If I had stayed silent after the anniversary dinner, nothing would have changed. Derek would still be making jokes. My husband would still be laughing awkwardly. And little by little, our marriage would have disappeared beneath 1,000 moments everyone else called not a big deal. One rainy Saturday afternoon, we were cleaning out a kitchen drawer when my husband found the anniversary card he'd bought me that night. He'd written inside it before we left for dinner. "No matter what happens, you'll always be the most important person in my life." He stared at those words for a long time. Then he quietly said, "I wrote this," and spent the entire evening acting like it wasn't true. Neither of us spoke after that. We didn't need to. Sometimes the hardest part of rebuilding trust isn't admitting you were wrong. It's realizing how easily your actions contradicted everything you believed about yourself. That was the day I finally started believing our marriage might actually survive. Not because the past had disappeared, but because, for the first time, the man sitting across from me was no longer defending who he used to be. He was becoming someone entirely different. A year has passed since that anniversary dinner. Ironically, this year's celebration looked nothing like the last one. No crowded restaurant. No group of friends. Just the two of us at a small cabin by a lake, where the only sounds were the wind in the trees and the water against the shore. As we finished dinner, my husband reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He smiled and said he had prepared another toast. For a split second, I felt my stomach tighten. He noticed. He reached across the table, took my hand, and quietly said, "This one is only for you." Then he unfolded the paper and began reading. "Last year, I failed the person I promised to protect the most. I thought avoiding conflict made me a good friend. What it actually made me was a poor husband. I can't change the moment I laughed. But I can make sure you never have to wonder whose side I'm on again." When he finished, neither of us spoke for a while. We didn't need to. Some apologies aren't powerful because they're emotional. They're powerful because you've already spent months living them before you say them out loud. Our marriage didn't survive because of one speech. It survived because every ordinary day after that speech matched the words. Months later, we ran into one of our old friends from that anniversary dinner. During the conversation, she casually mentioned that Derek had moved to another state after his divorce. Apparently, he still insisted everyone else had become too sensitive. No one argued with him anymore. Most people had simply stopped inviting him. It made me realize something. People who constantly hide behind, "It's just a joke," usually aren't losing their sense of humor. They're losing the audience that tolerated their disrespect. As for us, life became wonderfully uneventful. And that's something I never thought I'd be grateful for. We adopted another rescue dog. Spent weekends repainting the guest room. Argued about whose turn it was to buy groceries. Celebrated birthdays. Visited family. Built the kind of ordinary life that only feels boring if you've never had to fight for it. Sometimes people ask whether I regret walking out of that restaurant. The answer has never changed. No. Because I wasn't walking away from my marriage. I was walking away from a version of it where I was expected to accept disrespect just to keep everyone else comfortable. The moment I stood up from that table, I gave my husband a choice. Keep protecting the friendship, or start protecting the marriage. Thankfully, he finally chose the vows he'd made instead of the habits he'd inherited. Looking back, I almost feel grateful for Derek's toast. Not because it wasn't cruel. It absolutely was. But because it exposed a crack in our marriage that had been growing quietly for years. If he'd never raised that glass, my husband might never have realized that silence can hurt just as much as cruel words. And I might have spent the rest of my life convincing myself that I was asking for too much. I wasn't. Every spouse deserves to know one simple thing. When someone publicly disrespects your marriage, the person standing beside you shouldn't be wondering whether to laugh. They should already know where they stand. At our anniversary dinner, my husband's best friend called me the temporary one. 1 year later, that friendship was gone. Our marriage wasn't. Because in the end, the temporary relationship was never mine. It was the one built on disrespect. Thanks for reading.